Hello everyone, welcome to another Reading Russia Weekend Extra. At the end of a week that saw New Start expire, it was the last remaining treaty between Russia and the US putting limits on their nuclear arsenals. In Moscow, the deputy head of Russian military intelligence, Vladimir Alexeyev, was shot several times on leaving his flat. And officials from Ukraine, Russia and America held talks in Abu Dhabi. In a moment, the NATO chief in Moscow 25 years ago. I'll be sharing my memories of that visit. First, let's read some Russian newspapers. Now, Russian press coverage of the Abu Dhabi talks shows that Moscow, I think, is doing two things. It is praising the Trump administration to the hilt, and it is demonizing Europe and NATO, accusing European leaders of trying to scupper peace talks. It feels as if Russia is constantly trying to drive a wedge between America and America's traditional allies in Europe. On Thursday, the Russian government paper Rossiyskaya Gazeta described a visit to Kiev by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte on the eve of the Abu Dhabi talks as a demonstrative provocation by the European Party of War that seeks to scupper any peace agreements. While US negotiators are pressing Kiev to make territorial concessions that the presidents of Russia and the US discussed at the Anchorage summit, Rutte promised Zelensky the alliance's full military support and the deployment of a Western military contingent in Ukraine after a peace deal. Reports of possible multi-tier Western security guarantees for Ukraine are interpreted as torpedoing American efforts to end the conflict. On Friday, Kommersant reported that the Russian president's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, expressed gratitude to US negotiators who brokered three-way talks. But the position of the rest of the West is not constructive. Izvestia, once again, Europe is playing a destructive role in the Abu Dhabi talks. It's understandable that Moscow prefers to deal with the Americans rather than the Europeans, not only because it believes the US is pressuring Kiev into making territorial concessions, but also, as Izvestia points out, in Abu Dhabi, parallel to the talks on Ukraine, there was a meeting of the Russia-US group on restoring economic contacts. In other words, the US and Russia believe there are big economic deals to be done between them. On to the Winter Olympics in Italy, or as Soviet sport calls the games, Olimpizza Italiana. Team Russia is banned from the games over the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, although 13 Russians have been allowed to compete as neutral athletes, not under the Russian flag. The Russian government paper puts a positive spin on things, declaring that the 13 Russians are already winners. In current conditions, just getting to participate in the Olympics is already a victory. A few sour grapes creeping into some of the coverage. This is Komsomolskaya Pravda, which claims that Italy's Olympics were not well prepared for the guests. But following comments by IOC President Kirsty Coventry, Kommersant seems to believe that Team Russia will soon be allowed back. Another favourable signal for Russian sport in its battle to return to world sport from partial isolation was the speech by IOC President Kirsty Coventry at the session of the International Olympic Committee before the opening of the Milan-Cortina Olympics. She called for the sector under her jurisdiction to have the status of a neutral ground, completely distanced from politics, on which any athlete is free to compete. Some observers interpreted these words as an indication of the inevitability of Russia's full participation in the next Olympics, the Summer Games in Los Angeles in 2028. The Los Angeles Olympics, that's in the future, of course. Right now, let's turn to the past. 25 years ago, this month, so February 2001, the NATO Secretary General, George Robertson, visited Moscow. It was a trip aimed at improving relations between Moscow and the alliance. Now, I was already reporting in Russia. I'd like to show you my TV piece about the visit, and then we'll discuss it some more.
If you'd been in the Kremlin today, you might have thought that Russia and NATO were old allies. I hope it's not too cold for you here, Vladimir Putin asked Lord Robertson. NATO's Secretary General replied that he was just fine and that he was delighted at the working relationship which had developed between the two sides. There's no doubt that relations have improved. Lord Robertson opened a new NATO office in the Russian capital. The previous one had been forced to close 2 years ago when Moscow froze ties during NATO's bombing of Yugoslavia. The Russian military, which until recently was denouncing NATO as the enemy, is once again talking about cooperation. Moscow wants NATO to back Russian plans for a missile shield for Europe. But differences remain. Lord Robertson faced strong criticism over NATO's plans for enlargement. Moscow fears that if the alliance continues to expand eastwards and decides to offer membership to former Soviet states, Russia's national security could be threatened. It's a scenario which NATO rejects.
Enlargement is a concern to the Russians, that's no surprise. What we've got to do is to try and discover what these concerns specifically are and how best they can be addressed. And I think some of the fears and worries they have are misplaced and that they can be reassured.
So, for the moment at least, Russia and NATO have agreed to disagree on the controversial subject of NATO enlargement. But it's an issue which will, sooner or later, have to be addressed if the two sides are to stand a chance at forging a lasting partnership.
Goodness me, that feels like a lifetime ago. Russia and NATO talking to each other, discussing cooperation, boosting ties. But as you can see, even back then, a quarter of a century ago, Russia was expressing concern about NATO enlargement eastwards, claiming that it was a threat to Russian national security. And yet, the next year, 2002, in Rome, when asked by a reporter about the possibility of Ukraine one day joining NATO, President Putin said Ukraine is a sovereign state and has the right to decide which path it takes to secure its own security. In February 2024, I spoke to George Robertson, Lord Robertson as he is now, about all of this and about his interactions with Vladimir Putin. Did you ever get the impression that Putin wanted to join NATO? Did he ever talk to you about that?
At my second meeting with Putin, he said explicitly, he said, when are you going to invite Russia to join NATO? And I said, well, we don't invite countries to join NATO, they apply to join NATO. And he said, well, we are not going to stand in line beside a bunch of countries who don't matter. And I said, well, can we stop the diplomatic sword dance, just get together, work together and see where that takes us? I think he wanted it presented to him because I think he always thought and increasingly thinks that Russia is a great nation on the world stage and needs to get the respect that the Soviet Union had. So he was never going to comfortably fit inside an alliance of equal nations.
And he made it clear to you at the time that other countries, other former Soviet states like Ukraine, were free to decide their own security arrangements. If they wanted to join NATO, they could join NATO, for example.
During all the meetings I had with Putin, in the 3 years that I was in NATO and dealing with him, he never mentioned NATO enlargement once.
That's astonishing when you consider how today Vladimir Putin is constantly mentioning NATO enlargement and blaming NATO enlargement for the war in Ukraine.
We had a good relationship. My view is that it was the European Union that was the threat to the Putin model. After all, it was the offer of the association agreement to President Yanukovych of Ukraine which sparked off the Maidan demonstrations, you know, the Yanukovych departing from the country. The whole of that revolution took place as a result of the European Union, and I've got a very firm conviction that he saw that the European Union had changed the former communist countries. So although he now retrospectively claims that NATO is a threat, that NATO is the main object of his irritation, I think that's all been done retrospectively in order to justify a position that he's taken up, which maybe resonates more with the Russian people who know what NATO is, but really don't have any great understanding about what the European Union and European unionization actually means.
Vladimir Putin often expresses bitterness and resentment when he talks about what happened after 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union, and he claims that the West broke a promise. He claims that the West promised not to enlarge NATO an inch to the east. And this is mentioned consistently by Russian officials. Was there a promise by the West, by NATO, by the United States, to the Soviet Union, to Russia, not to enlarge NATO?
Who knows? There was certainly nothing on paper. There was nothing that was agreed. There was no treaty to that effect. And again, it looks as though Putin is building a case, on the basis of an assertion and then using everything to back it up. Claims that Gorbachev was tricked, claims that Yeltsin was probably drunk when he signed the Helsinki Accords, the Budapest Memorandum, the Paris Accords, the NATO-Russia Founding Act. But it was Vladimir Putin himself who signed the Rome Declaration.
Доброе утро и добро пожаловать.
On the 28th of May 2002, the same piece of paper that I signed as well, which enshrined the basic principles of territorial integrity and non-interference in other countries. He signed that, so he can't blame anybody else.
Lord Robertson, the former head of NATO, speaking to me 2 years ago. Now, just before I go, I'd like to remind you about our BBC Panorama film, about what it's like reporting from Russia. Our Man in Moscow, it's called, and it's now available to watch on the BBC iPlayer. We're hoping it will soon be accessible to a wider audience internationally. I should have some news about that for you in a couple of days or so. Those of you who've already seen the documentary will know that it contains some of my memories from Russia in the 1990s, like the time that I was invited to take part in a comedy show on Russian television called the White Parrot Club, with various Russian celebrities sitting around in a Moscow pub telling each other jokes. One of the people who took part in that programme was the composer Maxim Dunayevsky, an absolutely fantastic musician. And he wrote one of my all-time favourite pieces of Soviet film music, the song Ветер перемен, Wind of Change, from the Soviet version of Mary Poppins. And I'd like to play that now for you. Thank you very much for watching. Take care.